When our kids were smaller, it was not all that uncommon to find us in the floor rolling around and wrestling. And as a Dad Wrestling Federation legend, I am proud to say that I navigated 5 kids with a near spotless record. Now, I don't have like the official stats in front of me, but I'm something like a gazillion 1-1 over the years. That and one, that no contest comes from a time when Silas, our oldest, was about 3.5. And after I had soundly defeated him earlier in the afternoon, he blindsided me. I mean, blindsided me. I was laying on the floor on my side, kind of propped up on my elbow watching television, and his little self toddles into the room, and he just plops down, hind end first, on the outside of my leg. And so a couple of months on crutches and a knee surgery later, I begrudgingly and reluctantly awarded him the no contest under protest. The one in that record comes from this moment here. When, as you can see, I was ambushed, triple teamed in the midst of an otherwise fair contest, and they got the best of me that day. Thankfully, on that occasion, nobody had to go to the hospital, right? Which is kind of one of the goals, right? When you're in the midst of these moments together, because realistically, there's like 2 big rules when you're a dad and you're wrestling with your little kids. Like the first rule is to make sure you go easy enough that nobody gets hurt, right? Like, that's the most important rule, and it's the one mom always institutes, right? Like, you can't violate that rule. The second rule, though, is that you have to go easy enough that they can muster enough success that they want to keep playing, but not so much that they walk away with bragging rights, right? And as a dad, nobody teaches you this rule. Right? Like, you just instinctively know it when your kids start to get to the age where you can kind of roll around in the floor with them. It's just like downloaded into your brain, and you're like, yeah, Mom, I get it. Nobody gets hurt. We're going to make sure of that. But don't think for a moment we're going to let them get one over on us either, right? So it's important to make sure all the rules get followed. Because what did your mom always teach you? It's all fun and games until somebody gets hurt. And I would guess most of you have probably been there, as I have, if not in your own childhood, in that of your kids or grandkids or neighbor kids, where one minute everybody's just kind of having fun, horsing around, and then one thing leads to another. And all of a sudden, somebody's bleeding, and somebody's crying, and somebody's begging, please, 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 don't tell Mom, I promise, it's fine, are you okay? I'm sorry, it was an accident, right? Like, we know the drill, we know how that unfolds. How many of the scars that we carry come from our own choices? Those moments when a situation we thought we had under control started to get away from us a little bit. Things went too far, and somebody got hurt. A lot of those wounds, a lot of those scars are self-inflicted, right? A lot of the scars that mark our bodies are self-inflicted wounds. And I think the same can be said. The same is true of those invisible scars that we've been talking about the last few weeks together. Those scars that we carry that tell the story of our traumas, the scars that we carry that paint a picture of the things that we have lived through, the hard moments we've had to endure, the difficult things that life has thrown our way. And in the course of this conversation, we keep kind of coming back to this big idea. If you're following along in the YouVersion Bible app, it's a free download. You can go to the Events tab, and everything on the screen will be there for you if you want to jot some things down, take some notes. The big idea we keep coming back to in this conversation about scars is this: our scars mark our present reality by our past experience. The body can heal, but it doesn't easily forget. Right? If you have scars from that epic bike wreck or the time that you sliced your hand open, whatever it is, if you have scars, your scars will mark your present reality based on your past experience. Our bodies can heal, our minds can heal, but it doesn't easily forget. These things have a way of staying with us. Now, many of you were with us this past Christmas season when we kind of took a deep dive into the relationship between two brothers, Jacob and Esau. And we're not going to recap everything that we touched on in those weeks together when we talked about holiday family dysfunction, but we do want to kind of revisit their story today because for our time together this morning, we want to step into a moment in their relationship that we kind of just breezed past. Right? In that conversation back at Christmas time, we were really kind of leaning into the relationship between these two brothers. And so we touched on this moment, but we just kind of quickly moved past it because it really is a moment that features Jacob himself. And so we want to pick the background for a moment, recap their story, their relationship, so that we're all on the same page. And then we want to spend some time getting into this moment in Jacob's life where he has to come face to face with the scars that he's carrying, many of them self-inflicted wounds. So if you are familiar with Jacob and Esau's story, you will remember that they are twin brothers, and that while they were in their mother's womb, they were jostling and wrestling with one another, which caused their mother some concern, and so she sought some wisdom as to what was happening, and a prophetic word was spoken over these two children while they were in her womb. The prophetic word was that the younger would supplant the older. So the second-born will do the unthinkable, the unfathomable thing in the world of the ancient Near East, and he will rise above his older brother. And this prophetic word seems to already kind of be lived out in reality at their birth. Because Esau is born first, and Jacob emerges from the womb grasping the heel of his older brother. And so the text of Genesis tells us his parents named him Jacob, the grasper. And so the boys begin to grow up, and later on in their youth, there comes a moment where Esau has been out in the field hunting, and he comes back famished. And his brother Jacob just so happens to be cooking some stew, and so he says, "Brother, I'm hungry, give me some soup." And Jacob agrees on one condition: I will give you a bowl of soup if you give me your birthright as the firstborn. Esau agrees. And what is one of the worst trades of all time, right? He just came back from hunting, so either he wasn't successful or whatever, but he can find something to eat, and he trades his entire future for a bowl of soup. It wasn't a wise moment for Esau. But it seems like in that moment, this prophetic word from all the way back before they were even born is going to come to fruition. Except if you are familiar with the family story, you'll remember that their parents, Isaac and Rebekah, they played favorites. And Isaac favored Esau, the older son, and Jacob was kind of a mama's boy, it seems. And so he was favored by his mother, Rebekah. Well, in the world of the Old Testament, the family blessing came through the father. And so Esau has traded his birthright. But without Isaac's consent, it certainly doesn't seem like this trade is going to really matter all that much. Because Isaac is the one that holds the blessing. You remember how that goes, like when you were kids and like you traded something with your siblings, like, whatever it was, like, I'll give you this candy bar if you give me your bike, okay. And then your parents are like, wait, no, you can't do that. Like, undo that, right? So that's essentially what it seems like they're waiting on, is Isaac is probably just going to undo all of this. And so Rebekah launches a plan. When Esau again goes out into the field, this time at his father's request, she calls Jacob into her tent, and they slaughter a goat and prepare a meal for Isaac. And they put the skin of the goats on Jacob's forearms to mimic the burly, hairy body type of Esau. And Jacob goes in to his father and takes the food that had been prepared and deceives his father into getting his brother's blessing. So when Esau comes back, he learns what has happened. And as you might imagine, he is enraged that his brother would do this. And so he pledges vengeance. It says, when our father dies, I will kill my brother. And so Rebekah sends Jacob to live with her relatives, her uncle Laban. And Jacob spends 20 years with Laban, and they are two scheming peas in one very big scheming pod. And so they're constantly jostling with one another, going back and forth, trying to outdo one another, to both make sure they come out on top in all of their business dealings. But after 20 years of this kind of relationship, God comes to Jacob and tells him it's time to go home. And so Jacob gathers up his wives and his children and his servants and his flocks and his herds and sets out for Canaan to once more meet his brother and go home. And on the night before they are scheduled to meet, Jacob assumes that his brother plans to follow through on his 20-year-old promise to kill him. And so, on the night before he's to meet with his brother for the first time in 2 decades, Jacob sends his wives and his children and his servants and his flocks and his herds on across the Jabbok River. And then Jacob makes camp for himself alone. That's where we want to step into the text, pick up his story in Genesis chapter 32. I invite you to turn there with me. We'll have it on the screen. Again, if you're in YouVersion, this will be there for you. You can follow along there. Click on a device, open a Bible. Genesis chapter 32. We want to begin reading in verse 24. So Jacob was left alone, and a man wrestled with him till daybreak. Now, automatically, we should know something is a bit off, right? Because those two phrases seem in deep contrast with one another, do they not? Jacob is what? Alone, and a man wrestled him. Okay, so automatically we should have some questions. Verse 25, when the man saw that he could not overpower him, he touched the socket of Jacob's hip so that his hip was wrenched as he wrestled with the man. And then the man said, "Let me go, for it is daybreak." But Jacob replied, "I will not let you go unless you bless me." The man asked him, "What is your name?" "Jacob," he answered. Then the man said, "Your name will no longer be Jacob, but Israel, because you have struggled with God and with men and have overcome." Jacob said, "Please tell me your name." The man replied, "Why do you ask my name?" And then he blessed him there. So Jacob called the place Peniel, saying, "It is because I saw God face to face, and yet my life was spared." The sun rose above him as he passed Peniel, and he was limping because of his hip. Therefore, to this day, the Israelites do not eat the tendon attached to the socket of the hip, because the socket of Jacob's hip was touched near the tendon. So we find Jacob in this moment, alone in the dark, with a lifetime of scars. Most of them self-inflicted. Most of the scars of the deep wounds that Jacob carries that night are the result of his own choices. And so we find himself alone, carrying these scars, no doubt regretting his past and terrified about his future. Because remember, in the morning, he's going to meet his brother who wants to kill him. So we might imagine Jacob was not anticipating a restful evening. Right? If you've ever been in one of those moments where the weight of the scars and the wounds you carry are resting heavily on your shoulders, you kind of lay down and just assume, I'm probably not sleeping much tonight. And so Jacob lays down and finds himself wrestling, or more specifically, being wrestled by a mysterious man. And it becomes clear, as we've already seen, it becomes very clear early on that Jacob is contending with some kind of supernatural foe, right? Because a moment ago, he was alone, and now there's some dude grabbing him for a wrestling match. So we know something is afoot. It was common throughout the world of the Old Testament for people to believe that there would be spirits attached to things like rivers that would kind of guard the crossing from one place to another. And it seems like, at least in some ways, Jacob may be under the assumption that's what's happening, at least by the way that the exchange unfolds initially. And so here we find Jacob being wrestled by this mysterious figure in the night, and Jacob, the grasper, is told, "Let me go." Okay, let's not miss the irony that is layered into that command. And Jacob, the grasper, refuses to let go unless, he says, "You bless me." So let's make sure we're getting all that's happening, because there's a lot. Jacob, who stole his brother Esau's blessing, is still chasing a blessing that isn't his. He's still chasing something that does not belong to him. He still needs some legitimization to be who he believes he is supposed to be. Jacob says, "I will not let you go unless you bless me." Now, the response from the man should kind of catch us off guard again, because it doesn't seem to flow very logically. If someone says, "Bless me," the response we're expecting is probably not, "Well, what's your name?" Right? Like, It seems an odd question to ask in this moment as they're laying on the ground grappling with one another. And Jacob answers the question. He says, "My name is Jacob." Now, if we've been reading the story of Jacob and Esau closely to this point, in our minds we should immediately hear an echo of the last time that Jacob sought a blessing. Because when he goes into his aging father, whose eyesight is failing, with the goat skins on his arms, his father says, "Who is it?" The voice sounds like Jacob, but the arms are the arms of Esau. And Jacob's response to his father in that moment, in order to get the blessing, says, "I am Esau, your son." And now, 2 decades later, chasing another blessing, Jacob is asked his name. And he answers honestly. He says, "My name is Jacob." He is forced to admit in this moment who he is. He is the grasper. He is the one who is always chasing something just out of reach, something that is not his by rights. He admits in this moment he is a man who has spent a lifetime making choices that have left him scarred. And into those words, "I am Jacob," he begins to tell the story of his scars. "This is who I am." But the man responds and he says, "Well, you'll no longer be Jacob. You'll no longer be the grasper. You will now be called Israel, for you have contended with God and with humanity, and you have prevailed. You have overcome." And it's here in this moment we begin to get a sense of how Jacob's encounter by the Jabbok River can help us process the scars that we carry, even the ones that kind of are the result of our own poor choices. It's there in the notes if you want to jot it down. When the story of our scars, back up. Our scars convince us that we are who they say we are. That our story is reduced to the story of our scars. Our scars want to convince us that our identity is who they say we are. That our story, our identity, can be summed up in the story of our scars, in the story of our brokenness. And Jacob, in this moment, is a man alone. He's left every other relationship he had by the wayside. The only people he has left in his life are the people dependent on him. He has his wives, he has his sons, he has his servants. But he defrauded his brother, he deceived his father, he lied to and fled from his father-in-law. Every relationship he has been torched by his choices. He is a man alone, forced to contend with this idea that his story has become the story of his scars. And in this moment, this man who is wrestling with him gives him a new name, a new sense of identity. And when the story of our scars becomes our identity, we chase blessing when what we need is healing. Everything that has brought Jacob to this moment, all of the poor choices, years of broken relationships, have brought him to this moment. And he comes face to face with the reality that his identity has become the story of these scars. He is Jacob. He is the grasper. And when that happens to us, we tend to respond the same way that Jacob responds in this moment. We chase after blessing that is not ours by rights, when what we truly need is healing. Right? When our scars have consumed our identity, we are constantly looking for something, some validation that will let us know that we are not irredeemable, that we have not wasted every opportunity. We will chase after blessing, some sense of validation, when what we need in those moments, face to face with our scars, is healing. In this moment, this mysterious man gives Jacob a new name, a new identity. He is no longer the grasper. He's now the overcomer, the contender, the one who has prevailed, which could not be any more out of step with his current reality. Is that fair? Is anything about Jacob's reality before this encounter seem like he's an overcomer? Like he's a guy that's got it together? No, he is a man alone. And when he wakes up in the morning, he's going to come face to face with his brother for the first time in 2 decades, and he's probably going to kill him. So how in the world, in this moment, defined by the story of his scars, can Jacob be given a completely new lease on life, a completely new identity? It's bound up in the identity of the one he's wrestling. Right? All we're told at the outset of this scene is that a man wrestled Jacob. And as we mentioned, it would be common throughout the ancient Near East to think about the idea, the reality that there may be these spirits that would contend with you, that would stop your passage. And so Jacob, assuming probably that that's what's going on, says, "Tell me your name." Because the thought process throughout the ancient world is if you know the name of the spirit, it gives you some control over the spirit. You can manipulate it. The text that we read, the way that the response from this man to Jacob comes is, "Why do you ask my name?" Some translations say, "Do not ask me my name." Just as easily, we can understand the words this man speaks to say, "Do you really have to ask my name?" Jacob, do you not yet realize who I am? Now we know ultimately that Jacob does figure it out. He puts it together because the text tells us that Jacob called the name of the place Peniel, face of God, because I came face to face with God and my life was spared. So on a night when he's expecting to wake up in the morning, come face to face with his brother and his life be taken, he comes face to face instead with God, who begins to change everything Jacob knows about who he is and what it means to be blessed. And the sun comes up on Jacob's new life, and he sets out to meet his brother Esau with a new identity. He's no longer named by his scars, but it seems he has a fresh wound. Jacob leaves this encounter limping towards home. The text tells us that as the man wrestled with him, he touched Jacob's hip. And the word that gets used here, it can mean simply a touch, but it often has a force of violence behind it, to strike. And so Jacob finds himself struck in the hip by this man. Think back to those moments rolling around on the floor with my kids, right? You're wrestling around, and from time to time, as you might imagine, somebody goes a little too far, right? They get a little too forceful. And so usually you just kind of have to stop, right? That's one of the rules of Dad Wrestling Federation. You know, okay, let's time out, let's reset. But occasionally, after the reset, this particularly happened with our two youngest boys, and if you know those boys, this probably won't surprise you. But after the reset, even they would tend to stay a little overzealous, a little too energized, right, and go right back to wrestling a little too hard. And so when the kind of let's pause, reset, when that doesn't work, sometimes you have to use just a little bit of gentle force, right? Not enough to hurt them, but enough that they realize you're taking it easy on them, and so they should too. A reminder of the reality that they're not really in control of this situation. It makes me think of this scene where Jacob's demanding a blessing, demanding to know the identity of this being so that he might somehow manipulate and control it, because that's who he is, that's what he does, right? He's the grasper, the schemer. And this mysterious man, revealed by the end of the narrative to be God himself, touches Jacob's hip. A gentle reminder. You aren't really in control here. I think sometimes we come into these moments where we're carrying our scars and our wounds, and we refuse to let them go while we are wrestling with the very one who can heal us. And we come into these moments with the weight of our scars, desperate to get back what's been stolen from us. Desperate to get back the years that have been wasted, the opportunities that have been lost. And so we grab a hold of God as if he owes us something. And like Jacob, we say, "Bless me or else." All the while, we are forgetting that God is the one who wants us to be made whole more than we can desire it for ourselves. That he is the one who wants us to get back all that has been stolen from us, all the wasted years, the lost opportunities. God's desire is for us to be made whole. And yet in our pride and in our woundedness, we come into these moments sometimes and we refuse to let go, and we say, "Bless me or else," as if God owes us something. And sometimes the Lord has to press through our pride and our stubbornness and our woundedness in order to bring us to a place of healing. And sometimes that feels like a fresh wound. sometimes healing hurts. But when God rewrites the story of your scars, it often comes with a redemptive limp. Right? Sometimes when we come into these moments carrying our woundedness to a holy God, He has to push through our stubbornness. And so sometimes healing hurts. And God begins to rewrite the story of our scars, and some days it leaves us with a redemptive limp. Jacob walks away limping because he had been touched in his hip. Which makes sense, right? Because our scars mark our present reality by our past experience. But scars can also point us toward a different future. Jacob's old scars, the ones he carried into that night by the Jabbok River, they told the story of the grasper. This limp tells the story of one who has contended with God and with man and has overcome. Jacob comes away from this encounter limping, but healed from the self-inflicted wounds that he had been carrying for years, the scars that had come to define his very identity. Invite the band to come back. Throughout this conversation, we've said over and over again that we all have scars. And that every scar tells a story. The question is, what will our scars have to say? Many of our scars are self-inflicted wounds. They come from the choices that we've made, right? From the patterns we have allowed ourselves to continue in, the habits that we refuse to set aside, the identity that we have embraced. Oftentimes an identity that is defined by the very scars we wish we didn't carry. So I want to say to you this morning, if you find yourself in a moment where you feel desperate, where you feel isolated, where you feel alone, you find yourself grabbing at God in some futile attempt to force Him to bless you, to make Him do what you think you deserve. Blessing will not come from fighting with the one who can heal you. Do we notice how this scene ends? Jacob gets blessed, but not until he lets go. Not until he turns loose of the wounds that he's carrying. Not until he's ready to lay aside an identity defined by the things that have hurt him. And when we are ready to lay aside the wounds that we carry, to lay aside our scars, God is ready to heal us. He longs to rewrite the story of the scars we carry. And here's the thing, guys, it won't take the scars away. Right? The body can heal, but it doesn't easily forget. It won't take the scars away. In fact, it might even hurt a little bit. But when we allow God to heal what hurts us by the death and resurrection of Jesus, when we say yes to following Him, we will walk away from that encounter with a new story to tell. No longer defined by our self-inflicted scars, but a story defined by a redemptive limp that says we have been with the one who can heal us. Let me pray for us.